And this is what we're going to talk about. First and foremost, we're going to look at understanding the data. And this is critical because if we lay this foundation for what the data within Webex Contact Center actually looks like, it's going to unlock all these other aspects. We're going to be able to easily explore it. We're going to very easily be able to build these reports. We can share it. We can do what we want with it. So hang with me, especially through this first part, because we're going to lay that strong foundation and then begin to explore all the other pieces of the Contact Center Analyzer. Now, I think more than anybody, those who are passionate about contact center understand that the data coming out of the contact center is important, right? The contact center is kind of at the front lines of the business. That's how we're often getting customer feedback. That's often where problems first occur. And we're making lots of decisions based upon this data, so it's absolutely critical that we have accurate and up-to-date information. And you can see here, we're looking sometimes to reduce business cost. In many cases, we're paying agents based on this data. We're looking to drive that ever-important customer experience based on the data. So it is critical that we understand what's happening within our contact centers and how we can extract that data accurately and get our businesses and our users the views that they need. Now, it does go without saying, within a contact center, there are many, many, many different data points, right? So we have all types of various ways that we can extract the data, but this afternoon, we're going to very specifically zoom in on Webex Contact Center Analyzer, because Analyzer is the primary reporting portal for all things Webex Contact Center. And what Analyzer is, it's going to contain all of our real-time and historical data from both our customers' perspectives and all of their interactions, as well as the agent activities perspectives, right? What Analyzer is not, is it does not contain any types of configuration or administrative type data, right? So it's really uniquely focused on both the customer and the agent interactions in that historical and real-time perspective. So let's take a look at understanding the data. Where's my pickleball players at? Any pickleball players in here? Any tennis purists? Bear with me for a second if you are. So I started to play racquetball many, many years ago and really enjoyed it, really got into it, felt like I got to a point where I was pretty good at it, and you kind of feel cool saying that you can play racquetball, right? It's just one of those sports that sounds kind of cool. But a few kids happened, work got busy, and racket sports for me kind of fell by the wayside. But about 9 or so months ago, I picked up pickleball, and pickleball is highly entertaining, right? Great social activity. Just not cool, right? Doesn't sound cool to play pickleball, but it's still a lot of fun. And I wanted to use this concept of myself going to the gym perhaps to play an evening of pickleball to start to understand how we're going to break this data down from a Webex Contact Center Analyzer perspective. Now, if I think about what I want to know when I go to play a game or when I go to look back at a game, I'm going to want to capture specific data points about that game, right? And for our purposes, I'm going to call this my Game 1 session record. And there's going to be things that I want to know, right? Maybe who I'm playing, maybe where it is, how long the game was, of course, who won. And I'm going to write all of these unique perspectives into this session record, right? And similarly, my opponent is going to approach this game, and there's going to be very specific things that they want to know about this particular match as well. Some of them may be in parallel or similar to what I want, but some of them may be different. So I'm going to have a unique perspective from my side and a unique perspective from my opponent's side. And after the fact, if this is all the data that I have, I'm going to have a general understanding about what happened. But I'm not really going to have that very specific detailed level of data that I may want. I'm not going to know, were there dramatic points, right? How long did the individual rallies last? Who won? Was it a come from behind win? Was it a blowout, right? And that's where I'm going to introduce this concept of activity records. And just like from the session record perspective, I'm going to have an activity record for my perspective on the game as well as the perspective of my opponent on the game. And as this game progresses, I'm then going to write in the very specific details of each step of this game that happened. And as we can see here, at the end of the game, I'm going to have my 4 perspectives, 2 from my side at the session level and the activity record, and then 2 from my opponent's side at the session level and the activity record. And combining these 4, I'm going to have a complete picture of what happened with this game. Now, how does that relate to Analyzer? So let's take a look at some of those parallels. In Analyzer, we're going to have 4 unique session types or record types that we're going to capture this data in. First and foremost, we're going to have our customer session record. And this customer session record is going to capture the data from the point at which the customer interaction lands on the platform all the way until the interaction ends, right? That'll be one customer session record. And because we're talking about an omni-channel platform, this obviously does not have to be voice. It could be an SMS interaction, it could be a web chat, it could be some other social channel, right? But it's going to be that start to finish detail at the session detail. So we'll see things like Annie, maybe queue name, int, and start timestamps, right? And of course, this is by no means exhaustive of the type of data, but it just gives us an example of that session level. Now similarly, maybe in parallel, maybe not, we're going to have an agent start their day, and we're going to start an agent session record for this agent. And this is going to capture the data from the point at which the agent logs into the platform until the agent logs out. So if we think about maybe a typical agent's day, we would have the agent come in the morning, log in, maybe work till lunchtime and log out, and then come back after lunch and work another shift. For that agent's day, we would then have 2 agent session records, right? So we see here some examples of the types of data that are written in those agent session records. Now, again, we need additional detail, right? We're going to have a general understanding of those interactions. We're going to have a general understanding of maybe what happened at the agent level, but I do need that additional detail, and that's where we'll see those activity records that come into play, the customer activity record and the agent activity record. So as this interaction flows throughout the platform, I will see the unique detail both on the system side, maybe within the IVR, maybe within an AI bot, right, on a web chat, and then I'm also going to see the unique details at the agent level, like what were they doing, what states did they move through, when did they take different interactions, how long were those interactions lasting, right? Now, what are we doing with this data? Where is it going? So just like we have 4 record types, we also have 4 repositories. And those repositories are going to contain the data from each of those 4 unique record types. So I have that customer session repository and the customer activity repository, and then I have the agent session and agent activity repositories. So as these interaction lands, I'm going to write this data into these repositories with their each own unique record type, right? Now, if you're coming from something like an on-premise environment, maybe a SQL background, just think of these repositories as tables of data, right? This is just tables of data that we're writing into the environment. We're capturing that data, then we can extract it at a later date. All right, let's take a little bit more of a real-world example here. And I'm going to walk through a phone call. Again, it does not have to be a phone call, but just for our purposes, we're going to use a phone call. Now, when this phone call, maybe the customer's calling in to complain, maybe they need support, but when it lands on the platform, I'm going to initiate a new row in my customer session repository, and I'm going to write a customer session record into that repository. So I can see as this interaction moves throughout the platform, I'm capturing the different data points. And this customer session record is going to have that unique identifier. So we see there on the left-hand side, the customer session record contact session ID. And that's going to be so that we can uniquely identify this call at a later date when we need to go and investigate, maybe when we need to report on it for some purpose. Now, just like we talked about a second ago on the agent side, when that agent logs in, I'm going to create a new row in my agent session repository, and I'm going to create an agent session record with its own unique identifier, and I'm going to start to capture that agent session data, right? So I'll see those happening perhaps in parallel. Because it's agents logging in and out, it probably isn't happening in parallel with our customer interactions, but we'll have those unique interactions. Now, as our call moves through the IVR, maybe we've selected a queue, we finally have an agent that's available, we'll start to see some convergence and similarities between the data types that are written into these repositories as they overlap, right? So in this case, I see ringing, connected, and wrap-up states written into both my customer session repository as well as my agent session repository. And then we see ended written up into the customer session, and then finally the agent sign out on the agent side. Now, what about the detailed levels of data here? So if I look up at the customer activity repository on the top in blue, I'm going to see this interaction land in a new state, and I'm going to see it progress through its journey, right? And this is where I get each step of this call's journey, I get that detailed. So I hit it, see it in the IVR, I go into a parked state, which means we've queued that interaction. Finally, I see a connect where we're ringing the agent device. It's connected to the agent, they have the conversation, and then that time is ended. On the agent side, I see the agent log in into an idle state. They go into available state. They're selected for that call. It begins to ring. They're connected. They have the conversation. Then we see an agent wrap up. And then finally, the agent logs out at whatever time they log out, right? And we see the unique timestamps for that. So using those 4 repositories, I have a complete end-to-end picture of these interactions. But it does beg the question, how do I tie these all together, right? If I have 4 unique repositories, I'm in trouble if I can't associate these in some way, shape, or form. Maybe I have timestamps, but that's going to be fraught at best. And that's where these contact session IDs come into play. So we will see here, I have my contact session ID for my CSR written into my agent activity record anytime at which those two overlap, so that I can begin to tie all of these interactions and these calls together. And we do have multiple interaction points across these repositories, as we'll see here. Contact session ID and agent session ID are written into the customer session records, the customer activity records, and the agent activity records anytime that those overlap, right? There is no overlap between the agent session record and any of the contact session IDs, because that's the agent session level detailed. We're not actually recording customer interactions at that agent session detail, so we won't see that there. All right, so we've talked about 4 repositories. Just to keep things interesting, I want to talk about a 5th. This one is actually in early access right now, but it is there to keep us on our toes first and foremost, but it is also meeting a very specific need. And that need is, when it comes to the perspective of the customer session repository, there are some things that are missing, right? That maybe we've seen customers ask for additional levels of detail, and that's where this queue-based repository comes into play. So the queue-based repository is going to allow us to get at very specific data at the queue by queue level. So we're no longer necessarily looking at it at the customer level, we're looking at it at the queue level, and those same interaction points will tie together. We can see those customer contact session IDs tie into that queue-based reports. We'll talk about stock reports here in a little bit, but we are also introducing 3 new stock reports as a part of this. These are great to begin to understand what this queue-based reporting looks like. And on that note, if we take a look at a customer session record, I can see that I have recorded the queue, the team, and the agent that this customer landed with, right? But what I don't see is I don't see what happened before that, because the customer session records only contain the last queue, team, and agent that interaction landed on. And that's the challenge, right? Because in today's state, I could absolutely go into that customer activity record, and I could see that full customer journey. I can tie those two together, but that becomes challenging because we're having to kind of cross-reference reports if we're wanting to see that queue level data. So the queue record, as we can see, queue by queue is going to give us the level of detail as we see those customer interactions move through individual queues. So in this case, I was originally queued to agent John Smith. When I called in, I had a Rona event, and then I was then queued to Lisa Jones. So I see that level of detail across that whole journey. It lets me get a more specific perspective at the queue level. I'm definitely not going to read this slide, but I've included it as reference, and there's several other slides that are included as reference. They're hidden in my presentation today, but they are in your PDF in the space. Just other great reference points to use as understanding, for this instance, right, some of the major metrics that we're introducing as a part of this new queue-based reporting, some additional handle types that we're adding, maybe some formulas that are there, so make sure you go and take a look at these. All right, let's have some fun. I'm going to maybe put on a little bit of a pop quiz here, and we're going to zoom into a repository. It's important to note that this is not a call, this is not a report, this is a repository. And for our purposes, I'll call this the customer session repository. And I have 4 rows, meaning 4 unique interactions. Again, it could be calls or SMS messages or web chats. If I scroll all the way over here to the left-hand side, I would see those unique customer session IDs somewhere in this table. But I have 5 columns here: team name, agent name, transfer count, queue duration, and connected duration. And I want to use this to help us understand the different types of data that are in these repositories. Because when it comes to the data types, we have 2 choices of data that are going to be written into these repositories. We can either have field data, which is going to be alphanumeric data, or we can have measure data, which is going to be simply numeric data, right? So we see here team name and agent name. Quite obviously, we need alphanumeric data for those particular fields. For those other 3, transfer count, connected duration, and queue duration, I'm going to have timestamps, just counters, those sorts of things, so that's going to be numeric data. And this is very important because when it comes to reporting upon this data, we have choices with what we can do with it. So for field data, and remember that's the alphanumeric data, I can report on it with a count, meaning I'm going to calculate the total of that data, right? I can report on it as a value, meaning I want that actual field, give me the actual field, or I can report on it as a cardinality. And I was by no means a statistics major, so cardinality, I had to go look it up when I first learned this. Cardinality just means how many unique values are in that repository, right? And we're going to return that as a cardinality. For that numeric or measure data, you can see the different types of arithmetic activity that I can have on this. I could have sum, average, min, max, and then I can also report on it via count, or I can report on it via value. So here's the pop quiz time. If I asked you to return to me the value of agent name, it doesn't do you a lot of good, right? Because I need to specify which row I want returned. In this case, if I asked you for the value of agent name in row 3, anybody want to help me out? Agent 1, right? So you're going to return agent 1. If I asked you for the count of agent name, what would you return to me? In this case, it would be 4. Right? Because when we're returning a count, we're just simply returning the number of rows that query returned to us. So we have 4 rows returned, we're going to return a count of 4 in this case. If I asked you for the cardinality of agent name, 3, exactly, right? So we have 2 unique records, or 3 unique records, 2 for agent 1 and 1 each for agents 2 and 3. This is where it starts to get a little spicy. If I asked you for the count of transfer count, intuitively, we think it's just the 1, but again, it's actually 4. Because again, we're just returning the number of rows or records that we have in that query. So even though we have 3 0 values in this case, it's going to be a count of 4. I'm sorry? No, I do not work for the testing company. If we wanted to get at the actual number of transfer counts in this repository, I would want to write my report to return maximum, right? Or sum, one of those 2. So you kind of see how this begins to work out for us. If I asked you for the value of queue duration in row 3, you would return to me 22 seconds, right? So does that make sense? Any questions on that? Awesome. Now this has very, very important implications when it comes to report writing time. And we'll touch on this in a couple of places. But when we go to create a report, we have to choose which type of report we're going to create. One, we can either create a value-based report, meaning we're going to create a report that's returning those actual values to us, whether it's a field or a measured type of data, or we can have it to be something else, right? And just hold on to that for just 1 second, and we'll talk about the actual implications of that as we walk through the rest of the session today. Another important thing to note when we talk about the data that's in these repositories, at a user level or at a programmable level, there is no way to manually edit, update, add, or delete this data, right? That can only happen at a system level within Webex Contact Center. The only way that we can get data into Analyzer to be able to report on is via global variables. And global variables today are currently configured only in the legacy Contact Center management portal. They will be very shortly coming to Control Hub to be able to configure. And then as we configure these, we have a choice. We can set them as reportable. They can be not reportable. But if we mark them as reportable, then we can report on that data out of Analyzer. And you can see the different data types that we have as choices for the types of these reports or these variables. And another very important thing to remember is at a tenant level, we can have 100 global variables configured as reportable across the tenant, right? That doesn't mean configured, it just means marked as reportable. So you see here on our screenshot, my lovely red rectangle, that particular variable has been marked as reportable, so that would count against our 100 total. I could absolutely have 100 marked as reportable and then go configure 101st variable. I just can't mark that 101st variable as reportable until I go into that previous 100 and switch one of them to off and then go back and switch that 101st on. Secure global variables are coming very, very soon, so a little bit of a sneak peek on this. These are in the final stages of beta testing and early access, but these have implications on our reporting because they are by design not reportable. It's a way for us to pass around secure data within the platform into our agent desktops. It can be encrypted in transit, and then we will never report on that within Analyzer. So you see here account number, it is marked as a sensitive variable, and then we can't turn reportable to on in that case. We're going to encrypt that in transit, and we'll never see that within visualizations or within Analyzer. Another quick reference, right? I like to just include these and call them out because often these are common metrics within contact centers, and every vendor does it just a little bit differently. So here's how some of these common metrics are calculated from a Webex Contact Center perspective. Again, make sure you go and grab that and use that for your reference. All right, so we've laid the foundation, right? We have a general understanding of what this data is like. What do we actually start to do with it? And I'm going to start here just from the UI's perspective. How do we get into Analyzer? How do we use it? So we'll walk through this just a little bit. First and foremost, how do we get to it, right? We have multiple ways of getting to it. I can either use Control Hub and cross-launch via the analyzer link that's here. I can use the Contact Center management portal and launch it from there, or I can get to it directly with the URL and bookmark that, and then jump right into Analyzer when I need to. When we land in the UI, this is where we'll land. This is our home page. We'll see our 5 repositories, including the new queue-based repository there in purple. We'll see the types of amounts of data that are in those repositories. And then basically I have 4 navigation icons over there on the left-hand side. The home button is going to return us to this view. As I zoom in on these other 3, so our grid is going to move us into visualizations. I still call them reports because old habits die hard. But in the documentation, you will see them referred to as visualizations. And then that slightly less detailed grid is going to be our dashboards for wallboards, management level views, those sorts of things. And then the 4th one is variables. And these are not global variables that we talked about. Hang on to those for just 1 second. We'll take a look at what those variables are. They're just used for our reporting purposes when we're building the reports. A couple other things here to call out from a UI perspective. First and foremost is the time zone. And this has an implication for how the data is going to be presented to us. It doesn't impact the data that's sitting in these repositories, but at report runtime, we have 2 choices. We can either have it set to the browser's time zone, or we can have it set to the tenant's time zone. So if we have it set to browser, it's simply going to mean time of day is going to be considered to be 12 a.m. from whatever time zone the browser is set to. And on the tenant side, same thing. It'll be 12 a.m. from the perspective of the tenant's time zone, and it'll present the data to us within that format. We have folders for both visualizations and dashboards. We have a global search across the platform for those. It's important to note that those names do not have to be unique across folders, so I do have unique report IDs that are assigned to those. I can get at those reports directly with report ID or with a name as I search. And then I'll call out a few other places where this is important, but there are context menus that are available in certain parts of the platform. So we see here I'm looking at a particular report. If I click on those 3 dots, I'm going to see a context menu for the actions that I can take on it. It will depend on if this is a stock report or if this is something that I've customized. I'll have some different options there. And speaking of stock reports, so we do have over 100 stock reports that are available by default on the platform. These are great for meeting many common use cases, right? So if they meet your use case, you can take and run with that. If they don't, they're great building blocks. Take it, get in there, customize it, tailor it for your purposes, save it off with a new name, and you can be off and running from that side as well. A lot of these stock reports are tagged with the kind of the keywords that you would expect to see. So if you need a queue report, if you're looking for idle codes, you can search for those, and those will return the stock reports that are available. And then a lot of these are also segmented based on different perspectives. So we'll see here the idle auxiliary report. We have it segmented based on site, team, or agent, and you can go grab those for whatever purposes you need there. And then there are some stock reports that are more geared towards dashboards, and we'll see what dashboards mean in here in just one moment. But these are going to be things like cards, dials, some customer journey charts. So these are going to be hard-coded, and you can drag and drop them or filter them based on your needs and put them into those dashboards and have those management level views. I've used this reference frequently in the past, right? Just another great one of what are some of the common reporting use cases within the contact center. Here's the reports that you would go grab from a Webex Contact Center perspective, both with the names and those report IDs, so you can go grab those. Any on-prem customers from a Cisco perspective, either UCCX or CCE? All right. I hereby make you official members of the I Survive CUIC Club. It's very elite. But if we're talking about customers coming from CCX, whether it's yourself or you're helping a customer, we do have 9 stock reports that are included by default. And these will kind of help ease that transition from a data perspective, right? So these will be laid out in a CCX-friendly view, and you can kind of help ease that transition. A lot of these are just really great reports in general. When I'm first showing customers the platform, I will often show them the CSQ All Fields report. If you're in CCX at all, you'll certainly recognize that name. But it is a great perspective on the different types of reporting mechanisms that we have on the platform in that table-based view. few other navigation items that I'll call it here. This is one of my favorites, drill downs, right? So when we're in a report, we have the ability to drill down between different types of data. So if I see here on my contact details in Q report, I have 7 total contacts listed in my middle field. If I mouse over and highlight the little magnifying glass there, I can click on that and drill down, and I will see the 7 calls that are referenced from that report. If I want to see the detail from the customer activity repository or the customer activity record for one of those individual calls, I can then mouse over that unique contact session ID, and I can then get into the full customer journey of that call, right? So it's a great way to navigate between different repositories or between different reports. It's a wonderful troubleshooting tool or an investigative tool. Finally, too, this is another great one. As I am doing this, if I get the perspective that I want to see, I can use the drill down menu over there on the left-hand side to search and select other columns that I want to add, and then I can export out to CSV or Excel from this view. So I can ship that out right to my end user, whoever needs to see that, straight from that perspective. We also have the ability to do run mode filtering. So this is just great for those end users, maybe supervisors that need to filter between different queues, between different teams that they're managing, and they can do that at runtime. So you create the report, and then when they go to run those reports, they can kind of self-serve to filter those. We will see row segments come up here and here a little bit, but those filters are set based on the top 5 row segments that we have defined in the report. And you can select individually those or have all 5 of them turned on. Dashboards. So dashboards are pretty straightforward when it comes to Webex Contact Center because they are basically an open palette that we have to drag and drop our visualizations or reports into. So in typical dashboard function, these are great ways to combine different data perspectives, whether it's charts, whether it's table-based views, whether it's pie graphs, whatever the case may be. And then also, this is a really great way to combine data across different repositories. So if I want to have data from a customer session repository and an agent activity repository sitting side by side, dashboards are a really great way to do that. We have a lot of stock dashboards that are included with the platform as well, and then you can filter these at runtime also. So when you provide this dashboard view to your end users, you can then allow them to filter, and it will filter across all the visualizations that are included in that dashboard. And a quick cheat sheet on the dashboards as well, so go grab those. And lastly here, I kind of want to call out, because this is very critical, right? There's a lot of permissions levels that are available within Webex Contact Center. And when we assign agent roles to maybe different teams, to different queues, it's going to impact the types of data that they're able to see. So something we'll frequently hear is, hey, I have agents that are looking at the exact same report, but they're seeing different types of data. And most of the time it has to do with this, right? They have different roles assigned, so the data that gets returned to them is going to be different. Great from a roles-based access control perspective, but just important to understand from a clarity side. So the user guide details where those roles are set, and you can go grab that for reference as well. Now, if you've been here in the past, you may have seen this. There is an Analyzer 2.0 coming. There's a lot of work going on behind the scenes on this. Analyzer 2.0 is going to introduce a few things. Obviously, you see it looks different. There's a UI refresh that's happening with this. There's also an underlying data architecture change that's happening to allow for more streamlined data pipelines, allow for things like real-time data. You'll see that from an organizational perspective, where we've moved away from the folder format. I have my own opinions about that, but if you like tags or labels, you can use tags or labels to manage those. Some additional permissions levels that are coming with that. But currently, this is in beta, and I'll show you how to get to it if you want to go take a look at what's coming. And right now, only stock historical reports are available. If we talk about the things that are kind of coming down the pike next from a 2.0 perspective, these are the hit list here. So custom dashboard and custom stock creation, probably first and foremost important, right? You want to be able to customize those reports that are available. Additional permissions levels that we can set at the dashboard level. Currently, they're more set at the folder level, so we can get very specific with those. Multi-level formulas, so when we're creating our own unique calculations, I don't have to stack calculations. I can do those all within a single step. Custom cards, to be able to tailor cards to see what your data wants to see, right? And then, obviously very important as well, color coding thresholds, so we can alert supervisors or management teams to when things are perhaps out of sync with where we want them to be. All right, let's build some reports, right? Let's talk about the process of what it looks like to build these reports. So when I think about building reports, oftentimes we're going to have a user request come to us, and they're not going to know, hey, I want a historical report from the last 30 days with this types of data, right? They're going to ask us for a certain thing, and then we're going to have to help them craft that. So when we go to create these reports, we need to decide up front what type of a report we're going to create, and we have choices. Obviously, we need to choose if this is going to be a historical report, if it's going to be a real-time report. From a historical perspective, you can see the time range that we have there. We can do a look back of up to 12 months for the report, and we can span 13 months on that sliding 12-month window. From a real-time perspective, we can set things like interval, how long back in the day we want to look back, and then how often we want to refresh those. And then like we talked about, when we create this report, it's very important we need to choose, is it going to be a count-based report, or is this going to be a value-based report? And again, just to emphasize, these are defined at report creation time, and they cannot be changed afterwards. If you needed to change them, you would need to go back and create a new report. So I'm going to walk through a process that I would probably take when I go to create a report, and we'll see step by step. Some of these are mandatory, some of them are optional based on what you're trying to fulfill here. First and foremost, as we've talked about, I have to decide what repository I'm going to report on, right? I have 5 choices. I can do that customer session repository. Maybe I want to take advantage of those new queue-based records. In this case, I'm using the agent session repository, so I've defined that. Then I'm going to select whether this is a real-time or historical report from this drop-down, and I can choose the look-back time that I have for those historical reports. And then for historicals, I can optionally select an interval, right? How do I want to segment this data? Is it daily, weekly, monthly? And for those real-time reports, I can select that duration and refresh. Next, I need to know what data I'm working with, right? And that's where these profile variables are going to come into play. This is where we will put the data that we want to report on within this report builder. So we have some options when it comes to profile variables, and this is where our friends, the field and metric data types will come, or measure data types will come into play. So we can drag and drop these, and this is where we decide, am I going to look at total counts, or am I going to look at actual values? And we can define them by drop down here, and then we can add the profile variables to our builder. We will definitely take a look at this live here in just a second so that you can kind of clearly visualize what's happening here. We also have other actions that we can take on these profile variables. I can create an enhanced field, which is nothing more than allowing me to take and group data based on something that might be arbitrary to me. So if I think about something like queue name, I may know queues 1 and 3 is services, queues 3 and 4 is sales. I can create an enhanced field based on queue name, and then I can break out that data. I can also run formulas. So when I get into the situation where I need to create those custom calculations, build those, I can do those by creating and combining multiple profile variables, add, subtract, divide, multiply, whatever your purposes are there. We're getting close to beating this one dead, but it is so important. I'm going to emphasize it one last time here because it's often a point of confusion. When I create the report, do I want it to be count or do I want it to be value-based? So the decision point here is, again, for a value-based report, do I want to see that raw data? And this may be very confusing at the moment because if you think, oftentimes I want to see how many calls came into a particular queue, so I want to see that queue name besides the data that is sitting there, right? So how do I do that? So we'll take a look at what this can look like here in just a second. But if I take a look at this report over here on the left-hand side, I see a count-based report, right? Maybe useful for my purposes, not particularly. I'm just seeing 2 columns with 2 calculations there at the bottom. On the right-hand side, I see a value-based report. I'm seeing the actual value of my contact session IDs. I'm seeing the actual values of my queue names, but I don't want to have to sit there and manually tabulate all those. So what do? And that's where these segments come into play. I have the choice of segmenting based on columns or rows. That's simply, am I going to segment the data on the horizontal axis or on the vertical axis? So what that allows me to do here is I can see that I have a value-based report, or a count-based report, sorry. I have a count-based report in this case, and I'm segmenting it on that alphanumeric data, right? So I can take a count-based report, and I can segment it off of those field values, where then I see total number of contact session IDs in my queues, and that's where these segmentation comes into play here. All right, so we've defined the data. We've talked about segmentation. Dive into that just a little bit more here. On the segments, we see that we have row segments, and this is a great visualization of if I add these row segments, so I have 6 row segments here, priority matters, right? So first, I'm going to segment based on agent name, next on the interval, so on and so forth. I can drop and collapse those if I want to see only unique perspectives, but I can drop those segments in there as I need to. Optionally, I can also create filters. So obviously, these are powerful because I can filter at multiple different levels. First, I can do those runtime filters that we talked about. Those are going to be, again, just at runtime. Next, I can do it at a report level, right? So if I want to filter on something very specific at a global level for that report, I can do that. Or I can also filter on each specific column, and that will only impact the column. So if we think of something like queue name, if I only want to see queue XYZ, I could filter that at the queue level. Any questions on those?
Is there baked-in filtering for supervisory permissions based on the agents that they manage?
Yeah, so the question is there baked-in filtering for supervisor levels? And that's going to be defined by those row segments that you add here. So if you see here, these have been added as row segments. So if we want to create a report that allows our supervisors to filter on those, we would add those particular ones to that. Oftentimes, it's going to be team or queue at those top two row segments, and then they could do that runtime filtering. All right, I promised it earlier. This is where we'll talk about that variables tab. This is simply a way for us to group data to quick reference when we're creating a report, right? So if we know that those 3 queues that we want to get at regularly are something that we have to use across multiple report types, I can come into that variables tab and create those those variables either at the user scope or at the global scope. And then when I go to create those reports, I can reference those variables, which will call those specific data points that I've predefined. Next, we can optionally add, a report, a custom report summary there if we want to. By default, our reports will be summarized at the table level, but I can add additional levels of detail if I want to. I'll take a look at what that looks like here. So I can see here when I'm defining the report, I can filter or summarize based at the table level or at the queue level, and then I can run custom calculations on those summaries as well, depending upon how I want to see that summary tabulated. Another optional step, and this is again one of my favorites, is the ability to create modules. And these are simply, you'll see them referenced as compound visualizations, but it's a way for us to lay data out side by side and segment it or filter it differently, right? So if we want to see how many total calls have come in, we see here the CSQ all fields report, but I've segmented it based on last week and last month, so I can have that data side by side. And then last but not least, I want to select the data output type. Oftentimes it's going to be table-based data, but I have multiple different types of data or output types that I can select from: bar charts, line charts, pie charts. I think there's about 11 in total, and we can see what that looks like here in just 1 second. Now I want to take a look at a live environment. I don't skydive or anything, so I think for my own purposes, I like to get my thrills out of doing live demos, so we're going to try that here today. And oftentimes when I'm approaching this, I like to kind of put myself in the customer's shoes of what might be a request that would come to me, and let's walk through that and see what that looks like here. So we'll take Sophia's reporting request for our purposes this afternoon, and Sophia wants to see how many customers are abandoning in their contact center versus how many calls are coming into the platform as a whole. So we can see those 3 data points that she wants to see here. She wants to compare those incoming calls to abandoned calls. She wants to see this at a queue level, and then she also wants to see the data displayed in line chart format as well as table form. I'm going to switch my perspective here, and we will jump over to Control Hub, right? Because this is going to be our starting point for where we would launch Analyzer and where we begin to build this report. So I'm going to navigate over here to my quick launch for Analyzer, and I'm going to click on Analyzer, which will drop us into our homepage that we've talked about. So instantly we see here I have the ability to launch the beta 2.0 experience if I want to. I could do that either from here, or I do have the cross launch up here. I had a customer ask me the other day because they were afraid that if they clicked on the launch button, they would be forever stuck in 2.0 land and never be able to get back, but that will simply cross launch over into the beta experience if you want to see that. Here's the time zones that we talked about, right? I have tenant or browser time zone that I could set, and then I see my different repositories that are available here. So for building our report today, I'm going to want to go over to visualizations, I'm going to select visualization. You can see some of the folders that are laid out here in our demo environment, but I don't want to use any of those because I want to create my own. So I'm going to say create new, and I'm going to click on visualization. And this will look familiar, right? So we've just walked through what this experience is like, and we'll see what this looks like in the live environment. So first and foremost, I'm going to select my repository. And for our purposes, I'm going to use our fancy new queue-based repository. And I'm going to go ahead and rename this report here to Cisco Live. All right, next we need to define, is this going to be a historical or a real-time report? So I'm going to come over to my start time, and I'm going to drop this down, and I'm going to see the different types of data perspective that I have here at an interval. So I have last 7 days this week. I can do a custom date picker if I want to do that, or if this is a real-time report that I'm defining, this is where I would select that as well. In this case, I'm going to select the last 7 days. So we've got that. We've defined our repository. We've defined this is a historical report over the last 7 days. And this is where we need to begin to add that data. What types of profile variables are we going to use here? So if I select this, I am going to think about this. I want to see the total number of calls, because remember, we're going to compare total calls to abandoned calls in the platform. So we have a field called contact session ID. And this is, remember, we've talked about this at the beginning. Every unique interaction that lands on the platform is going to be assigned a contact session ID. So I'm going to grab this contact session ID for my purposes. I'm going to add this as a profile variable. And here's where we see one of our filter points, right? I can filter on this column right here. This is a column-based filter that's popped up. I can also choose which type of report I'm going to define here. I can do value-based if I wanted to see the actual value of those contact session IDs, but I do want a count-based report because we're going to be tabulating that data together. So I'll name this total calls here. And I do need a filter because if we think about it from the perspective of an omni-channel platform, I'm only wanting to see telephone calls, right? I don't want to see SMS or chat. So I'm going to see a channel type filter here. And I'm going to drag that in, and I'm going to select a channel type of telephony. Save this out. So we see the view update in real time, right? I've added a column to this. This is not actual data. This is just a sample perspective of what this report is going to start to look like. But I do need an additional piece of data here. I'm going to add another contact session ID in this case because I want to see total of abandoned calls. And again, just to emphasize that here, if I drop this down, I see value has gone away because we've already decided this is going to be a count-based report. Now I need a similar filter here. I'm going to say channel type for abandoned. I'm going to say telephony. But I also need to define, this is not just a normal call clearing, right? This is not some other type of call. I do need to look for a handle type here of abandoned. So I'm going to add a second filter to this particular column of handle type. And then if I drop this down, I will see abandoned as one of the handle type options. So I'll save this out. And then my report updates to see this view. Now, I want to see this in live perspective, so I'm going to go ahead and save this. We've already got our name defined. I have Cisco Live, and then because I have saved, I now have a preview button. So I'm going to go ahead and click preview, and behold my custom report, right? It's beautiful. Not actually, right? Not particularly useful, not particularly valuable in this case. We have some basic data, but we need more. So that's where we're going to start to do things like segment this data. That's where we're going to bring in other value types. So we know that we want to look at queue name. So I'm going to drop in a queue name here as a row segment, and we'll see how this perspective updates. I'll go ahead and jump into live view for this as well. Save it and preview. So now we're getting more interesting, right? As I resize this just a little bit. I have queue names, so I'm using a row segment to segment this data based on that alphanumeric value, right? I have queue name, but I have it beside my count-based report. So this is the way I can combine the two types of data. And I see the total number of calls and abandoned calls on the platform. But we need more, right? So I'm going to go ahead and add an interval to this report. And I'm going to add this interval based on a daily interval, and we'll see it be included by default into this report automatically. It's been added as a column segment here. Let's take a look at what that looks like. So I'll save this off and preview. All right, so we have this segmented across the horizontal axis here for our interval. This is probably not the most useful because if I look here at my top column, I see abandoned calls, and then I'm going to have to scroll all the way over here to see total calls. And this is where the difference between column segments and row segments comes into play. So if I close this and I move my interval over to the row segment, I then see here, this is getting more interesting, right? First I see queue name, then I see interval duration. If I preview and save this, probably more what I would expect to see in this case, right? Like I mentioned, I can collapse these if I want to manage that in those views. If I click on settings here, we can see that here we have the profile variables that have been added. I kind of get a sneak peek into how this report is laid out. I'm going to go back to my previous view. And then what were some of the other requirements that we had, right? We wanted to see it in table-based view as well as line chart view. So that's where this output type would come into play. Right now I've selected a table output type. I'm going to select line chart. Now this is a sample view, but I am in trouble here, right? Because I see no data available to render this chart. When it comes to our output types, there are some output types that require that horizontal axis, right? So a line chart, it makes sense. We need that vertical and horizontal axis to be able to graph something. So I'm actually going to move my interval back over to my column segment here, and then we'll see our chart start to update. And if I save this out and preview, I have my line chart here with all the data. I have my table-based view below. If I want to hide this, I can. If I want to remove it from the report completely, I could go back in and remove that, and then just have that graphic view. I can see here I have profile variables that I could filter on if I wanted to. The question was, why do some of the fields show 0 and why do that would be because there's been no calls that have come into that queue. I get where you're going with that. I'll have to double check to see why that's showing up in that current format right now. Yes?
So you had to change that one row segment back. So now your chart.
So my table, right, my table does not look like we would probably expect to see it. And that's where we'd want to maybe use a dashboard to combine multiple visualizations types, right? So we could, yes, yep, exactly. So the question was basically how are we calculating abandoned calls? Yeah, it would be, abandoned call would be if the customer hangs up the call or the call ends for any reason before it gets to an agent, essentially. That would be tagged as an abandoned call. All right, so I think we met Sophia's purposes here, so let's move back to our presentation. And I'm going to see if I can jump slides here. Here we go. All right, so we've talked about the foundation, we've talked about the UI, we've gone through and built a report. Now how do we get this out to the world, right? How do other users start to use it, ingest it? That's where we're going to talk about presenting this data. Here's the list of output types that we've talked about, right? So you can see those full list of output types that are available. There are additional output types that are coming in the beta. We can start to do things like trend lines. Heat maps are as close as we get to color-coded thresholds today, but those color-coded thresholds are coming in the future. We'll talk about some of those other stock reports that are available. This is one of my favorites as well, this customer journey Sankey chart, right? This is included as a stock report, and it lets you see the perspective of the entire contact center as a whole. So I can see at a glance where my calls are going, where my SMS messages are going. If I have email, I can see what types of volumes we have of each of those. I can see what queues they're landing in. I can see what the wait times and hold times are in those queues, and then I can even see down to the individual agent. So maybe I want to call it Agent Lisa for doing a really great job because I see she's handling many more calls than Agent J or whatever the case may be there, right? So this is a great dashboard perspective to give to our users as well. And here's some of the other output types that are coming as a part of Analyzer Beta. A great feature on this one is obviously we have the trend line here, but to your point about the different perspectives, we can see that we can easily bounce between perspectives in this case. So I see here a table-based view. I can mouse over and change that perspective right there, so kind of eliminate some of those side-by-side issues. We can share these reports out. Now, for those of you coming from CUIC, this is not the equivalent of a permalink, right? So we can absolutely share the URL to a user, and they can log in and they can view that report. But if we think about it, this is a cloud-based platform, so I don't want to be able to just send a link from any customer and have them jump into that report right away. So to get to these links, you do need to be an authorized user on the reporting platform, right? But you can share those. You'll see some of those limitations there. They don't have that drill down ability, and there are some other limitations. The question was, are there plans to do permalinks? And the answer to that is no, just from a security perspective, right? Because we don't want to have things just be able to be launched right away without any type of authorization. We can embed these reports into the desktop. We actually have a session on the agent desktop coming out tomorrow, so lots more details about the agent's perspectives on this data as well as the supervisor's perspective on this data. But we can take those very easily, embed them into the desktop. There's some example documentation here. It's actually just one line that you have to update from the code that's published out on GitHub, so make sure you check that out. And then on the agent desktop, we do have data pipelines that are coming out of Analyzer that provide agent performance statistics. So that can give the agents the ability to see across the contact center, across their queues, what's happening. And then supervisors also have a supervisor level view that they can filter on, and they can see that supervisor level detail. And there's some different ways that the filters impact what's happening on that desktop. So this is a great reference to see when I'm filtering based on team or when I'm filtering based on queues, how are those views actually going to update? Reports can also be scheduled. So these can have a one-time schedule. They can be a recurring basis. We can ship them out to Excel or CSV. You can see the size limitations that are there. 10 megabytes, pretty typical email size, and have those recur specific intervals. We can also export these visualizations, right? So we can, out of Analyzer, export them to CSV or Excel if we want to. And then I can import and export reports as a whole as well. So if I have multiple tenants that I'm managing, maybe from a partner's perspective or maybe different parts of a company or a merger, if I have common reports, I can move them out of one and into another tenant. A couple things to note there. We're going to retain the filters there, but the values are not going to be retained because those may contain sensitive customer data. So you'd have to just go in and redefine those values. All right, this is an important one, so I want to cover it as well, just to understand some of the limitations, right? So reports, when you define them, have a maximum of 150,000 records, right? We're way beyond what CUIC can do at this point, but that is important to keep in mind. We can have those maximum of 5 filters that are defined, and our filters can have up to 1,000 values. So if you want to pick 1,000 queues that you want to filter on, that would be a limitation. The one way around this is with regex. So the platform does support regex. So if you want to go in there and get really fancy, you could define a regular expression to filter based on those and get around that 1,000 value there as well. You can see, we talked about the date picker a second ago. Those date ranges can be up to 12 months, and we can report on data on that 13-month window. There are ways to get back to 36 months. That is something that is going to be addressed in Analyzer 2.0, essentially be able to define asynchronous reports. So you can maybe define a report that covers 36 months, send it away. It will run it in an asynchronous fashion and let you know when it's available to go out and download. And then just a couple of UI perspectives, right? Because these were recently added to the platform. If you have fields that are high cardinality, so think how many session IDs did I have over the past 30 days, right? That could be a bunch of data. So the platform will just warn you, hey, you might want to think about filtering that data down a little bit or defining it a little bit differently. And then the lowest refresh interval we have in the real-time reports today is 5 seconds. That is going to move to something more akin to live data from a CUIC perspective coming in the new Analyzer as well. And then if you really want to get fancy, we do have search APIs that are available to extract the data out of the platform. From Cisco's perspective, that data is yours, so you can go get it. There's tons of documentation that's published about it. We see a lot of customers use this to ingest the data into an analytics platform, something like Power BI. But you can make sure and go and check out the sample documentation and some of the sample projects that are available for those. And then a great GitHub guide of, here's the mapping between the data fields that are within Analyzer and how they will appear in the API for those of you that are wanting to go extract that data. And we made it. So thanks for hanging with me here. Lots and lots of detail, right? So I am certainly available here to answer questions if you want throughout the rest of the week. A couple of things I'll give you, right, is just what's next. So I would encourage you, this is the best way to learn. Go out and grab those stock reports, right? If you're new to Analyzer, go out and grab those stock reports, look at them, see how they're being run, right-click or click that 3-dot context menu on that report, create a copy of it, and look at all the profile variables, look at the calculations that are added there. That's probably the way that I learn best rather than just going and flat out reading the documentation, because I might fall asleep if I did that, right? So it's just a great way to explore and then go reference the documentation when you need to. make sure you go check out the API guide, right? Lots of powerful stuff you can do with that API. That's probably where you reach the next level from an integration perspective. And then, of course, the user guide is out there. So if you want to see those repositories, if you want to see the full scope of the data that's in there, that user guide is the best place to look.